Okay, let me just get everything set up. Give me just a moment. There we go. Okay, good morning. I'm Dame Calandra, and today we're going to talk about modern tapestry weaving. There is a handout that's linked into the chat. Let me go ahead and share that again just to make sure everybody can find that. It can also be found on the website that we're using for the event. And that one does go into some details talking about period tapestry weaving in the Middle Ages. And a lot of times when people see tapestries, they do think about, say, the unicorn tapestries, which are gigantic works that actually were not done by a single artist. They would have been done by a whole team of artists, sometimes about 40 of them, working on small 1-foot sections at a time. And it could take months or years to finish. And some other examples of tapestries that you can look at through time would be looking at Peru in the Andes. And there's a lot of pre-Columbian examples, and many of them are brightly colored because they actually did have cotton in Peru in pre-1600s. And there's a lot of different creative motifs and pictures that you can find in there. And then some other examples that we see moving through time, the Navajo weaving, the blankets, technically they do use tapestry techniques. Weaving a tapestry essentially means weaving a picture or shapes into your woven form that you're doing. And with the modern tapestry, the emphasis tends to be more on texture and color, and a lot of times it's not set defined shapes. It's just a lot of creativity going into it and playing with maybe just a little bit of pattern. Sometimes you just see monochromatic stuff that's just a change in texture. But really, anything that you want to try to weave with, you can. Put it in there, experiment, play with it. I'm going to show you some different techniques on how to get started and how to incorporate multiple yarns and to create some basic shape type things of how to do that. And so I'm going to switch over to the camera on there in just a moment. So here's an example of using modern techniques that I did. And this, you can see how it really plays on the different textures and shapes. And this one's a little busy. A lot of times right now you'll see pictures where it's all white, and that's fun to play with too. I really like color. And so I have some mixtures of homespun yarn that's thick and thin, doing different techniques with that. And this one really has a mix of everything because I just wanted to show you what different things are. And so I've got cotton and wool mixtures and acrylic in different places. And a fun thing that I'm going to show is you can actually create holes in your weaving. And sometimes that's called slot weaving. And that was a common way that you would see for people to incorporate patterns, is that you would end up just, weaving this independent sections and then you connect them over and then just create the little holes here and there. So we're going to have some fun with things. So getting started, first thing you need is something to weave on. A loom of some sort. You can buy tapestry looms that do have all kinds of fancy gadgets and things like that. You can also buy simple frame looms. If you're just getting started and wanting to play around, making a loom out of cardboard, this one's actually a purchased one, but you can easily make one out of cardboard, is a good way to get started. Also, you can find a lot of these very easily at craft stores, or if you have somebody with a 3D printer, because that's how this is made. And this is just a simple thing for just making some small little practice pieces, which you can actually use those. You can hang it up, or you can make small pieces to make into a bag or coasters or things like that. Or for Amsgard use, you can make a belt favor, which is eventually what this is going to be. And this shows where you can create different pictures and use it for heraldry and things like that. Or just have fun. Well, it's all fun. So how you warp your loom is going to be different depending on the loom that you have. For something like this, I keep meaning to make a notch, but if you're going to be using a cardboard loom, it may be helpful to make a hole to be able to put your yarn through, kind of a little on the side to help with trying to tension. But even without that, we can make this work. So I'm going to show how I would start it on this and how I would start on a different loom. So with the cardboard loom, I'm going to leave a tail because I'm going to weave that in at the end. And I'm going to tie a knot around my first peg. Some looms that you have are going to have actual pegs. Some will have nothing. You can actually just use a picture frame without the glass in it. And I'm going to tie, actually I started a different way than I want to. I'm actually going to tie this where I can allow to have some tension to be able to adjust it. So I'm going to tie a slip knot. Or attempt to. There we go. I'm going to tie a slip knot because then as I go, I can slide it and adjust it and then be able to help with the tension. With this type of weaving, you want to have an odd number of warp threads. Your warp threads are going to be your vertical threads that go this way across the loom. Your weft is going to be the thread that you weave with. So I'm not going to warp this all the way. Now I could warp all the way around the front and back, and then you could weave on the front and the back, but I'm just going to loop this around my notches. And I'll show how to tie onto a frame in a moment. I'll just get this set up here. And the fun thing with cardboard is you can make it any size that you want. Most people have access to it around. So let's count the threads here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So 11. That'll be my last one. So once again, I'm going to leave a large tail. Now what I'm going to do with this one is I'm not going to tie it right off here because I want to be able to keep at least one end a little bit open, that if I need to adjust tension that I can for tightening things. It's not going to get super tight on a cardboard loom, but it still can be usable. So what I'm going to do is, since I didn't go all the way across, I'm just going to weave this tail through my notches a little bit. And then I'm going to wrap it around one of the pegs. This is where sometimes I've taped it to the side so that it's open, or I may, actually I'm going to wrap around two. I'm going to tie a knot, but it'll be one that I can get undone if I need to. I'm not going to pull it super tight, but because I wove it through a few extra pegs, I've still got some tight tension going there, but I just left this loosely so I can untie it if I need to. So on a frame loom, or this type of frame loom at least, what I do is I tie onto the side, and that way I can move things up or down as I need to. And so I just find a spot and I tie a little bit of a knot and then start trying to warp. So similar thing. Some looms will actually have a tensioning device on it, and so that makes things easier. But those tend to be a little bit out of my price point. So this is also showing how you can easily do some weaving with something that you have around the house. As I said, you could use a picture frame or whatever you may have, cut up a cardboard box. What I'm using for the warp is cotton. This is actually the kind of the generic cotton that you can get about at any craft store in Walmart. It's usually something in cream. It changes depending on the store that you're at. I find this a good one for most things. Sometimes you may be weaving with thinner, but cotton is a good thread for warping because it's sturdy and usually doesn't have much stretch. And so that'll be better than, say, wool has a lot of stretch and give in it. And when you take it off of the loom, once it's not stretched anymore, it's going to totally distort your piece. So you want to use a yarn that does not have much stretch for your warp. Some other tools that you're going to want to have on hand is you may want something to beat the threads with. So as you weave, use this tool to push down the threads. You can use a comb. This came in a little set with those other little looms that were there. You want to have some needles. Weaving needles and yarn needles come in many different shapes, sizes, materials. You can get a lot of plastic ones fairly cheaply. Those are pretty good. There's also metal ones. So this is a pretty long one. You can get some long metal ones also. They also come in horn and bone, whatever you feel like using. But I would recommend having like 5 or 6 around. That way you don't have to keep changing things. You can also get what are called tapestry bobbins, and those allow you to wrap the yarn around it like on a shuttle, which is what this is, but they have a point on them so that you can weave with it still. They're very similar to bobbin lace bobbins, but they tend to be a little bit thicker and heavier. This is another thing that you can use if you're not going to be doing a lot of fine detail, but you're just going to play with some patterns and textures. You can use a shuttle, which those also come in many different sizes and shapes. And generally the yarn's wrapped around between the ends on this. I have it balled in the middle because this is homespun yarn that I didn't want to put into a regular ball, so I just wrapped it around the shuttle for convenience. But we're going to use that a little bit later. Of course, want to make sure you have some good sharp scissors. And then it's helpful to have some things that you may hear called pickup sticks. Generally, that is going to be something that's usually long and flat. This one's a little fancy arrow thing that came with one of the looms. Sometimes I will use rulers. Those are good. Or paint stirrers. Because what it is it helps that if you're doing a lot of long areas that you're going all the way across, that you weave this through one direction and you can raise it up, which makes it easier to pass a shuttle or a needle through. That I can just stick it through like that. Versus if it's down, it doesn't really go through very easily. Now that works for one direction. Unfortunately for the other direction, you're going to have to manually pick up your threads as we go through. Some people like to have a long pointed thing that they can do for that to go ahead and open up the shed for the other way. Knitting needles are great for that. Something else that I find helpful is also having either additional flat sticks or dowel rods. Because what I'm going to do to make this easier to weave on the cardboard is I am just going to stick dowel rods underneath all my threads on the top and the bottom. And this helps raise things up a little bit so that it will be easier to get your yarn or your roving through. Adjust my knot there. And I've got tension problems already. We're going to fix that. Okay. And as I said, you could use other rulers or paint sticks down there, and the dowel rods help a little bit too. So it just gives a little bit more space to be able to maneuver things, and that way it doesn't mess up your tension a whole lot. There are many different ways to get started as far as how you want to start weaving. Now I'm just going to be playing around with different colors and things today. I'm not really trying to do anything that's going to really match or anything like that. Mostly it's what is going to be seen by the camera and how is that going to work. So we're going to get some yarn to get started on that. Now, how much yarn you want to start with is up to you. A lot of it's going to come with practice and how much that you can handle at the same time, because you can't keep the yarn on the ball. So I have probably about 5 feet that I cut off to work with. For me, that's a good length for starting. So I'm just going to thread my needle. And I am going to use a knot. I call it a sumac knot. It may be a Rhea knot. Rhea and sumac knots, they're the same, only one goes one direction, one goes the other, and I honestly never remember what. But for this purpose, I'm just going to call it a sumac knot. So I am going to go under. Now I'm going to start a couple inches up because I find it easier to do that for me. You can work where you work all the way down at the bottom, but that can be difficult to start. But the reason why I'm using a row of knots first is it helps with setting the set, essentially the distance between each of your threads. Because one thing that you can do, okay, I've got these wide notches. I could have warped this with 2 threads in each knot to give me more warp threads to be able to do more detail. And if you're wanting to do a detailed picture, then that's a good thing to do. Okay, so I went under the thread. I'm leaving a tail. I'm not knotting it. I'm going to cross over the top here and actually, okay, I am tying a knot for this first one just to make it easier. Some people say, oh, you should never tie knots. Well, sometimes it helps, and it's okay. Do whatever you want, whatever you feel like trying to do it. Okay, so I'm going to go under that thread. So I have to remember what I'm doing. And then I'm going under it again, or around it essentially. So it's just wrapped all the way around the thread. And I'm going to do that again. Now be consistent whether you start with going under or whether you start, because that's one way. The other way is that I can come from behind here and I can wrap it this way. You see how these two are going. Oh, let me make it easier. They're going the opposite directions. So just make sure that you use the same one going all the way across. I'm going to not take that out right now just to make things easier as we go. I do like it where I come from the opposite side, so I am on the left side of my thread. I'm going under and just pulling the thread, pulling my weft around my warp. And then trying to make sure that everything ends up being around the same distance. And so you would do that all the way across. You can also look up a technique called chaining the warp, or you can just start weaving over and under for a few rows. But I find that the knots makes a good starting base and helps better with consistency of the spacing for the threads. It'll also make things easier when you take things off, that you have that row of your knots. Now you could also do a row going back the other way and have the 2 rows of knots together. And that will actually create kind of a braided look. This right here is 2 rows of those knots together, the sumac knots. And so it gives a little bit different texture. And that's something that you can use, of course, in the middle of your weaving too. There's a lot of different things that we can try. Okay. almost to the edge here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about weaving structures. Your basic weave, your plain weave, is a simple over and under. So let me go ahead and get this set up for something to show that. So I'm going in to create my shed. A shed is what you pass your shuttle or needle through. So I created this one where my first thread, I am going to go over it. And I have this set up that I can just pass my needle. Well, actually, I made a little mistake there. So one thing with the knot on your end, if you make a mistake, you just undo it. I need to go around my thread again with that final knot so that things will work out correctly here. Well, yes. Okay, now to pass things through. Now I'm not pulling things tight. If you look at pictures of modern tapestry, if you go to Pinterest, you'll find lots of them where they start looking like an hourglass. That happens if you try to pull everything tight. See, as I start to pull this thread is right on top or right next to the other one. And so you don't want to do that. We want to do what's called bubbling. And so I've left it kind of loose. I like to use my fingers, but some people like to use a beater. As I said, you can use a comb or buy the things that are called beaters. And you use this to gently push it down next to the other thread. And that's called packing when you get that down like that. So that first one, I was able to just easily pass through that shed. Well, now I need to change my shed to go back through. And so now this one, I'm going to start going under. Since I went over for my first one, I go under for this next row. And if you just kept going like that over and under, that's just plain weave. What I'm going to do with my tail on the end here, there's different things you can do. You could just leave it and weave it through at the end. I like to catch it on the side a little bit. So I'm pulling it through that loop from my row that I just wove. So that it's going to go up a few rows on the side here. It does create a little bit of bulk on there. So it's up to you what you want to do with that. Okay, so I have did two passes the same color. That creates a solid line. So we'll call that color A. And now if you wanted to create some different effects with just playing around with just colors and things, there's a lot of things that you can do. So 2 rows of one color creates a solid line. Then if you were to weave 1 row of another color right here, then that create and then weave 2 rows of color A again. That's going to create a dashed line. So 2 of A, 1 of B, 2 of A is a dashed line. If you alternated AB and AB, that's where you get these columns, which can be used to create different effects. I've used it for creating fields and crops, things like that. And then if you want to switch how they're offset here, is you have your AB, AB, and then weave another row of B, and then start doing your AB, AB again, and or A or whatever. Just, after you've woven a few columns, weave a solid row, and then start alternating again. Then you get your offset columns, and that's actually how you can create a checker effect too. Just have to be careful how you're doing that. But this is just simple alternating different things, and there's a lot of different patterns and that you can do with that. And that's a simple thing to start off with. Now, if you look at the handout, it shows some different types of other structures that you can do. And different methods for trying to join things so that you can start building up shapes. And I'm going to show that here in a moment. Dig out some yarn. I'm going to go ahead and start a second thread, because for most of these techniques you need to have at least 2 different colors or threads attached to your piece. Now I'm going to start it on the edge. You can actually start a thing in the middle, but I would recommend not trying that when you're just starting out. And there are some tutorials that you can find online for how to add a thread. Or if you get to that point and want to do that, just let me know and I'll show you how to do that. But we're going to start with the simple things today. So I need to make sure that my thread is going to go over when I start this one. But I have to attach this new thread. So I'm going to leave the tail open on the end of this one. So I'm going to go ahead and weave a little bit over. Careful to leave my tail there. And then I'm going to take the red on the other side and I'm going to weave over to it. And this is where we have a lot of different options of what we do next. Now, if we were to say I have this thread right here in the middle that they're meeting at. There we go. There's nothing is going over this one. So I could take this thread and just go over it. And what I'm gonna do with this one is I'm gonna weave all the way back through to this side. And beat things down a little bit there. And I'm going to take the green and I'm going to weave back through the other way. This is one option what you can do. This is what creates that slot that I showed at the beginning. Because the threads are not joined together, it creates a hole right here. And when you're using a lot of fine threads, the holes really aren't very noticeable. Now in the modern tapestry, you could take advantage of that and you could pull things tighter and make a more enlarged hole to help create a texture effect with that. So that's one way that creates a little hole. So now we're going to go back and weave through again. We're going to try something different this time. And I'm going to take both of my ends that I had here. I'm going to catch both of those on the side. Because we do have some different methods. We have dovetail, or we have interlacing. And stacked. It's just some different terms. Some of those are on the handout with some pictures showing what those look like.
The needle through the male end of the zip tie a knot.
All right, so there I wove over to this here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show the stacked method. So on that one, I'm going to go ahead and weave back through with my red. And then I'm going to take the green and I'm going to put it right on top of it. Those are making sure we're going correctly of the over and under. There we go. This creates kind of a dovetail look. I'll show another example of that here in a moment of what that looks like. But I just put that right on top of the red one, and that'll create, if I kept going and weaving rows with that, that's going to create the little dovetail right here. That's the alternating stack where these gray and green are at. Now, something else that you can do, I'm going to show another method as we weave back over. This time I'm going one thread less than where I was before. We start to build up a little bit of a structure here. Be careful not to pull too tight on the ends. So what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to, once again, I'm going to weave back with my red. But what I'm going to do with the green this time, I'm going to interlace these. So I'm going to put my needle through the bottom of that last red loop there, and I'm going to pull up and through that little loop. And now you see that the threads are connected. They're intertwined or interlaced into each other.
I'm only on here because I've got to be in the COK meeting.
So then we're going to.
Hello, if you are talking, if you have, please check to make sure you have your mic muted. Or I'm going to mute you. It's okay.
So there's many of your basic ways of doing this. Now, another is to help create some different shapes. Like here, we're going to use the meet and depart method, which is kind of similar to what I've shown, but just a little bit different on the staggering, how we create these different diamond shapes or triangles or flames, depending on what you want to do with that. Okay, so I'm going to weave through to a certain point here. I'm going to show some fun things with some different textures here in a moment, but this is the basics to get you started and different things that you can try. Okay. So we got to our thread here in the middle. I'm going to go ahead and take the red and just weave back through at this point. I'm making it stop there. And the green is going to go over. Now this is starting like the slot, but we're going to do this a little bit different, that it's not going to form a slot. It'll be a slight little hole, but it's not going to be, I'm not going to build up and just weave the same thing over and over again. So for the next row, I'm going to weave to one less than where I wove for the previous one. For the red and the green, I'm going to weave one more than what I wove before. So this was the last one I ended for the green. So this time I'm going to go over to the next thread. So it would be an under thread for this one. So this is called the kind of meet and depart, meet and separate. It does create a little bit of slot there, but it's not going to be a big noticeable hole. So this is a way that you can create some different shapes and textures there. And see, with all the different methods we use, you can see how it's also starting to create its own pattern, and you're not just having straight rows. So those are the basics for joining things and how you can create things. If you wanted to create some defined shapes, something that's helpful is to draw what's called a cartoon. And that's just a simple drawing of what it is you're wanting to weave. You can place it behind your weaving or off to the side. Now, a lot of times you may want to draw in reverse because usually the side that you have facing you is actually going to be the back. But it's up to you on how you want to do that. The reason why with the side that's facing you is often going to be the back is if you're trying to weave in different ends or you're starting something in the middle of the piece, is that you're going to have that new join on the top. So that's technically going to be the back when you're done with it. But you can get creative and, you know, I've been pushing everything down straight, but you could push things down, you know, tight, pack down one part tighter than the other. So it starts to curve a little bit. You don't have to keep everything perfectly straight. You can weave little waves into it just by how you pack down your threads. So if you push down the middle a little bit more here, you get that gentle slope like I have right here. And that's all that is just how you're packing things. But you can see the different methods and how you can have threads just kind of going different places. I'll play around with the different alternating colors to get different effects. I have one that I started a while ago that was actually kind of a landscape. And this one just has some simple structure. I used some of the sumac knotting to create some differentiation and texture in there. And this is where I'm starting to build up some trees. And then this is where I was kind of trying to emulate crops in the field. Just using some simple techniques on there. Here shows another way to keep your threads organized a little bit. Is you can make a butterfly. Let me demonstrate how that works here. If you're not doing too detailed areas, it kind of works to do this. So I'm leaving a little bit of a cord end. I'm going to do a figure 8. Make sure it's consistent direction, the same direction. I just figure 8 between 2 fingers. Okay. And so then I'm going to take, I always mess this up. I'm going to take this end, I'm going to pull it back and then through the loop. Actually, I should have incorporated that end in there too. There we go. And then you can pull things, and I didn't do that right, or look up directions and stuff. It's always when you're trying to show things that things don't always work out right, but that's a way to keep things organized, that you can gently pull the thread and it's not super tight. Okay. So now that we've gone through some basics, we have just a few more minutes left. I know there's not a whole lot of time. I want to show how you can play with the textures of things. So roving, or technically a lot of times we call it roving, but often it's comb top. That's a big fiber thing to go into, but we're going to use the term roving just for the moment here. It's just fluffy wool that's not spun. And you can just put that in. You can just weave it like you would with the yarn. Or you can play around with it and pull up a little bit to have it peek through. And then weave another tight row of, I would say use, if you're trying to peek through things like this, I would weave a row of regular yarn after it. And then you could add another row of woving again, because that yarn's going to help trap it to keep up that texture. Now, of course, this would be something that you would do with, say, a wall hanging to keep that you would have for decorative. It wouldn't be practical to do this for anything that's going to have regular use. You can also do the knots with it. Just, wrap it around, create the different textures. That's a big thing with this weaving, is just having fun, experiment with different things. There is really no right way or wrong way as long as it's actually staying together. The only wrong way is if you wove everything the same way, the same thing, it's going to fall apart because it's just going to go off if you're not alternating your over unders and things like that. If you just wove everything the same direction through the same shed the entire time, that's the only way that's really going to fail you there. Just have fun and be creative. And see the texture where I just loop that around and creates a little bit of that braid, or having this go up like that. And then you could alternate just so with the yarn going across here. And if you're a person that likes to plan things out, you can, draw out a sketch of what you want to do and how you want it to look. Or you can just decide, I'm just going to let the yarn and the wool tell me what it wants to be, and just kind of go for it. Whatever looks right to you. So they did that row to tack down that thing. And I would actually, with the popping through, I would go ahead and weave back a second row, the same with the sturdy yarn, just to give it some structure. And you can make it to where that's really not going to be very visible either. If you had more roving and wanted to have things pop through again, I can see where that might create a little flower look or something like that. Okay, so the final thing would be how to take things off the loom. There are a lot of different options with that. If you did weave all the way down to the bottom, well, even if you don't, you can just pull the loops off. Sometimes, though, that may destroy your cardboard bloom. And so then you do have to cut things, which is why it's often recommended to leave about 6 inches so that you have enough room to be able to either weave the ends in or to make fringe. And there's a lot of different tutorials that you can look at for that. How I ended this one, it was a little mess here, is I took 2 or 3 cord ends, because on the end I'll have 3, and I just tied square knots. And then my intention would be to weave these in to the piece. Pretty much with anything crochet, knitting, where you're burying the ends in your piece. That's the basics, and we just have a couple minutes here for the next thing starts. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording.